So I have to admit something right off the bat before we get too far along, and that is, as someone who spends a lot of time studying and lecturing on texts from our earliest Christian traditions, the Gospel of Mark is my favorite book of the Bible. Why do I love the Gospel of Mark? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let me just count the ways. I love it because it was written by a regular person. Its original language is full of grammatical errors and reminds me of a misspelled tweet that gets shared over and over because the message is just that dope. I love it because it's like an onion, so multi-layered, each story actually encompassing multiple meanings at once. I love it because it's so subversive, constantly taking jabs at a superpower that is oppressing a people, yet at the same time it's full of humor. I love it because it paints a portrait of a not-so-perfect Jesus, one who gets angry, one who goofs up. Because it's the closest we get to the original unmessed-around-with recipe. Because in its earliest versions, it ends without resolution, leaving that work to its audience. Because even its writing is a means of railing against perfectionism and the politics of respectability. It wasn't written by a doctor or an aristocrat or someone with authority, but that doesn't stop the Gospel of Mark from being damn near Shakespeare. But don't get me wrong, I also notice things that are unsettling to me, and I'll talk about those too. In fact, I'm just going to talk about the whole book of Mark, okay? Just to set the stage. Written around 70 CE, it is the oldest and shortest of all the Gospels in our traditional canon. It was written right around the time of the reconquest of Israel, this time by the Roman Empire. Thousands were tortured and tens of thousands died. So you can see how the stark plot of this gospel became drenched in pain and drama. The author is anonymous, and the title, like most ancient writings in that time period, was probably added later. Though we aren't sure where it was written, most recent proposals point towards Syria or Galilee as its origin, which would be about 80 miles from Jerusalem, where the temple was destroyed during the siege. This particular text takes place in that same general area near Capernaum in Galilee. Its audience lived in a large multinational urban area around the Mediterranean basin and was probably Greek-speaking, middle or lower class, and illiterate. So this gospel was meant to be heard, not read. It was written in a common language, which points towards the popularity of the book at this time. And it was written in simple Greek with an oral storytelling style. Now, in a culture where less than 10% of the population could read, where all knowledge, learning, teaching, memory, entertainment, business, etc. was oral, where the actual movement of Christianity was an oral phenomenon, why did the author suddenly write it down? Scholars have pondered this question, but I think a quick look back at the circumstances around the writing shines a light. The author was surrounded by death and destruction, by pain and trauma. He writes the word immediately a lot. Of the approximately 85 times that word shows up in the New Testament, 41 of those times are in this gospel. And the whole thing can be read aloud in like 2 hours. In fact, in the original Greek, the top of the selection for today actually starts with the word immediately. This traumatic environment brings about a sense of urgency in the writer for the survival of the story of Jesus. As the musical Hamilton says, he's writing like he's running out of time. We see this urgency throughout history with people who have faced trauma and the reality of the swiftness of death. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of it at the March on Washington. He said, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. This is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action. Death's door breeds urgency." In a commentary on this gospel, biblical scholar Joanna Dewey explains how these oral traditions, these stories came together. She writes that the Gospel of Mark is a series of short stories loosely connected by frames. A frame is transitional material. In our pericope, it's the words, "and immediately after they left the synagogue." The individual stories circulated separately, and it was common in oral cultures for stories about an individual hero to be grouped together into a larger narrative. Storytelling would have happened then, as it does now, in many different situations. Dewey described it as happening informally in their daily lives, in oral performances by reputable tellers, by wandering teachers, evangelists, and performers. Stories would be heard in the workplace, home, outdoor community gatherings, or more formal Christian worship situations. She posits that storytellers would have adapted, expanded, and contracted narratives in response to their audiences. So we have this oral tradition that is written down smack dab in the midst of the pain and trauma of this conquest by the Roman Empire. In another Mark commentary, biblical scholar Marianne Tolbert writes that this village would have been full of displaced people with no family. It would have been dealing with sickness, disease, with famine. The conquerors never quite figured out how to feed all the people they conquered. Mark's Jesus, Tolbert points out, calls into existence a new family based on doing the will of God. This Jesus is a healer of diseases and a multiplier of bread and fish. So you can imagine why this text would have been popular. Hal Taussig writes in a New Testament that Mark's story of Jesus, the healer, seems to resist conclusions either that his power triumphantly wins or that he is a tragic failure. Both healing and loss persist. Which brings me to today's text. And it's been a few minutes since I read it, so I'm just going to quickly remind you of its context. Jesus heals one person, then he heals a lot of people. He goes out to pray, the disciples look for him, and he suggests going on to preach, which he does along with casting out demons. In this pericope, the mother-in-law of one of the disciples is ill. Now, in 70 CE, there was a very different understanding of gender culture. Women are defined by their relationship to a close male relative. We know that the writer is feeling a sense of urgency, so he kind of bulldozes through a lot of stories and details, including hers. Someone mentions she's sick. Jesus goes to her, takes her by the hand, lifts her up, the fever leaves her, and she starts to serve them. She doesn't get a name. She doesn't get a voice. She doesn't even get agency until the very end when she is in service. The mother-in-law is an example of one of 5 healing stories that happen in the first chapter of this gospel. They are there to set the stage for Mark's depiction of Jesus' ministry. Now, the text is incredibly androcentric, centered around all things male, as is the time. But this author seems to be trying to circumvent this where he's able and aware. Tolbert suggests that his stories may have either A, challenged restrictive cultural rules, or B, indicated the outcast status of women attracted to Christianity. Still, Dewey notes, women seem for the most part to only be mentioned when they are exceptional or necessary to the plot. The author of this gospel doesn't even mention that there were women also traveling with Jesus and the disciples until almost the end of the book. It's hard to reinsert them into the story after the fact. Imagine this is your favorite movie, and you get almost all the way to the end, and suddenly the narrator's voice breaks in and is like, oh, and those people there, they were there like the whole time, too. That's what we're dealing with here. But I guess we don't actually have to imagine that because it still happens every day. In all our contemporary movements, women's voices are silenced. We are now in the middle of Women's History Month. And just a couple of weeks ago, we wrapped Black History Month. But right there in the gap sits Black women, left out of both sides of that conversation. What we are dealing with here is intersectionality, where race and gender discrimination overlap. This term, coined by law professor Kimberly Crenshaw, aids in the fight for visibility and inclusion. In an article called Why Intersectionality Can't Wait, she wrote, being front and center in conversations about racism or sexism is a complicated privilege that is often hard to see. The better we understand how identities and power work together from one context to another, the less likely our movements for change are to fracture. This intersectionality is what Sojourner Truth was talking about in her famous speech, Ain't I a Woman? And what Polly Murray, who was a civil and women's rights activist, a lawyer, and an Episcopal priest, meant when she challenged what she called Jane Crow. Intersectionality is at the core of the Say Her Name movement, where women of color who've been killed by encounters with police were named and brought to attention through hashtags on social media platforms. The goal is this: how do we make sure everyone has room at the proverbial table? This text gives us a great model. Once Jesus and the disciples enter the house, the men immediately tell Jesus about the sick mother-in-law. It's such a great example of allyship. They took on the struggles of the mother-in-law and placed her in the center of the conversation, using their voices in places where she had none. And because of their voices, something could be done, and it was done. She was actually healed. Note, twice at the top of this text, the author has used the word immediately. Immediately they entered the house, and immediately they told Jesus. But after that, the gospel writer who is feeling this sense of urgency gives a little more time to this healing story. It's our job to continue to immediately speak up for those who cannot, and to recognize that the healing may take more than just our urgent words. The Greek word used for what the mother-in-law did once the fever left her is diakonia, which means to minister, serve, do service. It's the same word used to describe what the angels did for Jesus after he was tempted in the wilderness at the beginning of this chapter, and it's the same word used to describe to the disciples what discipleship should look like. This is how those who are voiceless find their voices and use them to aid the fight for justice, for righteousness. They stand alongside Jesus and the God of the oppressed. They align themselves with allies who advocate for their healing. Because of this moment with Jesus and Simon's mother-in-law, many were healed that night. The mother-in-law's doorstep became a threshold for healing for the entire city. In the midst of the pain and trauma of being conquered, there is a story circulating of hope and healing. We, in this country and in this world, are in the midst of our own pain and trauma. Can you imagine this text read aloud in Puerto Rico, where a year ago people lost everything and are still struggling to put their lives back together? Or with those 112 still missing Nigerian girls who were stolen from their boarding school nearly 4 years ago? Or in Flint, Michigan, where some people still don't have clean water? Or Alabama, where a UN official reported seeing some of the worst poverty in a developed country? Or where children are fighting for their lives in the face of gun violence and lax or non-existent gun laws? This is where the work is, in figuring out how to use our voices when we feel voiceless. We can do this all kinds of ways. Ministry takes on many different forms. Show up at the rallies and the protests and take note of who is there and who is not represented in the crowd. Register at 5calls.org and help make change in our government by making 5 calls a week to different officials. They'll even provide you a script if you're nervous about what to say. Talk to Minister Rob Stevens about opportunities to participate in social justice work. Use your voice to speak up for those who cannot. As Paul wrote in his letter to the church of Corinth, "Woe to me if I do not proclaim the gospel. I have become all things to all people so that I might by all means save some." Show up. Show up at the table. Show up and be willing and engage. Rabbi Joshua Abraham Heschel was one of a number of rabbis who marched with King in Selma. He was later asked if he had much time for prayer while down there. His response? "I prayed with my feet." Marching is ministry. Calling your elected officials is ministry. We are God's hands and God's feet. To quote words attributed to Francis of Assisi, preach the gospel, use words if necessary. This is how God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven. We are instrumental in revealing God's kingdom here on earth. We must help complete the dream. Now, the second part of this scripture is equally as important. After healing many in the city with various diseases and sicknesses, after a night of casting out demons, Jesus gets up in the wee small hours of the morning and finds a deserted place to pray. He models for us respite. Take a little time to be alone with God. Or as we say at my home church in Indianapolis, have a little talk with Jesus. The work is long and difficult. King paraphrased an abolitionist and Unitarian minister from the 1800s when he said, "The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." So, beloved, we must pace ourselves. The book of Isaiah reminds us that they that wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up on wings like an eagle. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Do you have a time and place where you take a moment with the divine? Be it in prayer or meditation, are you finding quiet time to wait? I generally snag mine in the morning when I first wake up. And then I grab some more when I'm on the train. I use this app called Buddhify. I don't know if y'all know that app. It's dope. You should get it. When is yours? It's important to make space for both. Prayer is when you talk to God, and meditation is when God talks to you. Wait, I say, on the Lord. In the ancient time period of our text, people understood all sickness to be personally caused, either human or superhuman powers, and this idea resonates so deeply with me now. We are all, in one way or another, sick. America is sick. And we get it honestly. White supremacy is in the water we drink, in the air we breathe. It is America's sin. It is America's demon that needs to be cast out. The Gospel of Mark is the most liberating gospel in our New Testament for oppressed and marginalized people. So let's find our way, using the example of this text, to keep liberation present in the face of pain, loss, and trauma today. What if our actions, our service, our ministry, our diakonia could wipe out discrimination? What if it could end gun violence? What if our actions could shift us towards an egalitarian community? Let us stand alongside Jesus in this story to include all and make all people whole. May it be so.